Clinton sent me on another punitive expedition. It was to destroy the fort and stores at New London, near my native place where I'd spent my childhood. I demurred. He insisted. Washington was already on his way to the south in chase of Cornwallis. I was to divert him from his purpose. I did conscientiously all that I could, but New England was barren of troops. I had no army to destroy. To capture Boston was out of the question. Nothing else counted. I first learned about Fort Griswold as a teenager. I can't for the life of me remember what my friend and I were doing down in Groton, but I do remember he pointed out the fort to me and he said, "This place is pretty cool. There was a massacre here."
I got involved with the Friends of Fort Griswold when they first formed in 1995. Our goal was to keep the history of the fort alive. As a child, I lived down the hill from the fort, and I used to play in here. And I used to play cowboys and Indians and run across the earthworks and played softball down between the powder magazine and the shot furnace, not realizing the historical significance. The tours just came accidentally. I was walking my dog one day, and there were some people reading the signs, so I asked them if they knew what happened here. And they said they didn't, so I said, "Well, what would you like to hear?" I like to start my talk by bringing them to the memorial gates and pointing out the plaque on there with the shows the 165 defenders, then the 88 that were killed, and the 28 that were taken prisoner, and the 35 who were wounded so badly that they were eventually paroled. 13 escaped, and one 12-year-old boy was released. I also point out on the list of the defenders, there were 2 African Americans, Jordan Freeman and Lambeau Latham, as well as a Pequot Indian. So it wasn't just white guys here. There was a mixed group of people who were trying to defend the fort against an overwhelming force. Okay, from this point, looking out across the river, you can see why this is such a strategic site. See all those houses and General Dynamics, and even further down is Pfizer. None of that was here, but you could see clearly out into Long Island Sound and the mouth of the river. So that shows why this was such a strategic point to have a fort. It was really the primary protection of New London and Groton.
So, from a strategic perspective, at this point during the Revolutionary War, why would the British launch a raid like this? What were they trying to accomplish?
Well, there could be 2 things that the British are interested doing here. Number one, we already have action happening at Yorktown, so we have Cornwallis down there. The siege is starting to develop, so why not launch a raid or some sort of attack behind the enemy, farther up north? Maybe get Washington and Rochambeau to shift their focus from down south in Virginia to back to the New York area, up to Connecticut. So that could be one of the reasons. Another reason could be, well, this area is a source of privateer activity. So these private vessels that are licensed by the Continental government to perform acts against British ships. An attack on this area could help alleviate that problem.
At 1 o'clock the next morning, we arrived off the harbor, when the wind suddenly shifted to the northward, and it was 9 o'clock before transports could beat in.
Now, had he arrived when he was supposed to have, the battle probably never would have happened. Both forts would have just surrendered because they didn't have anybody here.
Amphibious assaults are difficult, even in the modern period, and also weather's always going to get a vote. You look back at the history of events such as D-Day in June of 1944. That's delayed because of weather for a few days. So this by no means is a one-time problem. In fact, it's part of our planning process. If we're doing something as simple as just taking a couple of vehicles down the road to go get service or something like that, we still have to put in our plan, what are we going to do with the weather? What is the weather right now? What is it projected to be? What safety measures will we take, especially if it's raining or that type of thing? Now, as far as this operation for the weather, I believe he does make the right decision continuing on for a couple of reasons. One, they're not going to be trying to stay here for long term. It's simply meant as a raid. And because of that temporary nature, he could always withdraw. So if he continues with the operation, he and his forces start to move up both sides of the river. Even if they find things aren't going well, they can always retreat down the river back to the sea. It's not as if there's an American or a French fleet waiting off the coast to cut off their route of escape if they do run into trouble. If things aren't going the way that you want immediately, you don't call the operation off. You absolutely look at what's happening and see if things are getting to the point where maybe you should call them off, but you don't automatically call things off if they're not going the way that you want immediately.
These are finds that were made during archaeological surveys at Fort Griswold between about 1982 and 1984 by a group from, and here we've got the report, from Boston University, and Ricardo Elia was the principal investigator at that time. And this was done with a little bit of Park Service money, and the Connecticut Historic Commission provided funds for that. Really what they wanted to do was assess the grounds and understand more how much intact archaeology might be there, because they were starting to do some kind of adding new paths and trails, and they wanted to make sure they weren't going to cause any disturbance to this really important site. So what we have on the table in front of us, and I'll kind of just try to walk through a few of these items, are some of the highlights, I think, from their excavation. Two really typical finds are these gun flints, so typical for the period.
So this is some kind of blade here.
Yeah, so we have a big knife blade. This has been described as a butcher's knife. So it may have been something from the kitchen, right? These guys had to eat, and they were cutting up their meat. But it may have been a personal knife as well. And again, it's just something they brought with them from the farm. People were living and eating on this site, so it's kind of cool that we found this big
fish hook.
Big fish hook, right? So we're right here on the Thames River, and there's no better fishing probably in the state of Connecticut.
I mean, who knows? Someone could have been fishing right when they first spotted the British fleet. It would have been right at dawn, perfect time to fish.
Right.
As soon as I had daylight so as to see the fleet, it appeared a short distance below the lighthouse. 2 guns was the regular larum, but the enemy understood that, and they discharged a third gun similar to ours and timed it alike, which broke our alarm, which discouraged our troops from coming to our assistance.
Again, we have to remember at this time, there's a lot of decentralization, especially on the American side during the American Revolution. It's not as if they have a strict setup of procedures that all 13 states would follow. It might be common knowledge for this area that those 3 shots did represent a safe vessel approaching, as opposed to 2 shots, which would be a warning. Who knows how long they used that particular set of signals, because all you would need in that case is some loyalist in the area to observe it for maybe a few days, pick up on what the different shots mean, and get that information to British forces. In regards to if the 3rd shot was a planned deception or not, we may never know. If it was a planned deception, then yes, it is a great example of adaptability. It would also be a great example of intelligence gathering prior to an operation. If it's sheer dumb luck, then that's also an example that sometimes that's the way battles go.
The men soon landed and formed a line from Leicester's Gut to the White Beach, and the enemy advanced with a slow march until they got upon high ground. And then they went quick from one wall to another, and we retreated, exchanging shot every opportunity. We proceeded to the town of New London, constantly skirmishing with rebels, who fled from hill to hill, and from stone fences, which intersected the country at small distances. I was first sergeant of Captain Adam Shapley's company of state troops, and was stationed with him at the time, with about 23 men at Fort Trumbull, on the New London side. This was a mere breastwork, or water battery, open from behind. I had the pleasure to see Captain Millett march into Fort Trumbull under a shower of grape shot from a number of cannon which the enemy had turned upon him. And I have the pleasure to inform Your Excellency that by sudden attack and determined bravery of the troops, the fort was carried with the loss of 4 or 5 men killed and wounded. We spiked our cannons and commenced a retreat across the river to Fort Griswold in 3 boats. The enemy was so near that they overshot us with their muskets and succeeded in capturing 1 boat with 6 men.
In regards to the malicious action during the early part of the battle, mainly the hit-and-run tactics, ultimately the spiking of the cannon and the abandonment of Fort Trumbull, That goes along with how we usually see militia fighting in this war. Everybody knows the story of Lexington and Concord, how a militia force ultimately forces a British force to return to Boston. But for the most part, typically militia would not stand up in battle to British regulars. And good commanders, good patriot commanders, would understand how to use militia correctly. So we can look at events, especially down south. You look at Daniel Morgan and his actions with militia at the Battle of the Cowpens, where instead of telling them to stand and fight, he tells his militia forces, all you have to do is 1 or 2 rounds, and that's all I need from you. So he's not expecting them to put a long-term stand-up fight to these British regulars. He leaves that up to his Continentals that he has with them as well. So we can see similar things here. So I would say that those hit-and-run tactics are what we could expect from militia. They're not going to do a long-term stand-up fight, especially if British regulars are coming at them with bayonets. So in terms of how the militia conduct themselves on the western side of the river, I think it's the best that we could expect of them.
On taking possession of Fort Trumbull, I found the enemy's ships would escape unless we could possess ourselves of Fort Griswold. From information I received before and after landing, I had reason to believe that Fort Griswold, on the Groton side, was very incomplete, and I was assured by friends to the government, after my landing, that there were only 20 or 30 men in the fort, the inhabitants in general being aboard their ships and busy in saving their property. On gaining a height of ground in the rear of New London, from which I had good prospect of Fort Griswold, I found it much more formidable than I expected, or than I had formed an idea of from the information I had before received.
That tells us the hazards of bad intelligence. Again, though, it also tells us that things happen in war, things happen in battle, things happen in real life. Things are not always the way that you expect it.
I immediately dispatched a boat with an officer to Lieutenant Colonel Eyre to countermand my first order to attack the fort, but the officer arrived a few minutes too late.
Arnold's inability to send a message over to Colonel Eyre to let him know that he, in fact, was the one marching towards the major fortification tells us about the difficulty of communication at the time. I can't even imagine how difficult and, frankly, frustrating it would be in these days before walkie-talkies. One of the things that we stress in the American military is this idea of mission command. So this idea that a commander sets his or her priorities, the standard for what will happen, the desired end state, and then leaves everything else up to the subordinate commanders or subordinate leaders. Micromanaging will not help anybody, and it's critical to the success of a military operation that a commander does have that amount of trust in subordinate leaders. Because we have the Thames here separating the two forces, I would assume that Arnold was at least forced to have this trust in Colonel Eyre. He knew that he couldn't quickly get a message over to Colonel Eyre. I think Colonel Eyre made the right decision continuing on. He's the one that's having to exercise the independent command. He's the one that has the responsibility. And so he's the one who's expected to look at the situation in front of him and make that command decision.
The garrison, with the volunteers, consisted of about 160 men. Soon after our arrival, the enemy appeared in force in some woods about half a mile southeast of the fort, from whence they sent a flag of truce, which was met by Captain Shapley, demanding an unconditional surrender, threatening at the same time to storm the fort instantly if the terms were not accepted. They were again met by our flag, which brought back to Colonel Ledyard the demand, if they had to take the fort by storm, they should put martial law in force, that is, whom they did not kill with balls should be put to death with sword and bayonet. Our flag went to the British flag with Colonel Ledyard's answer that he should not give up the fort to them, let the consequence be what it might. When the answer to their demand had been returned by Captain Shapley, the enemy were soon in motion, and marched with great rapidity in a solid column to within a short distance of the fort, where dividing the column they rushed furiously and simultaneously to assault the southwest bastion and the opposite sides. They were, however, repulsed with great slaughter.
They're no big cannonballs, right? But frankly, when I see these, I get even more anxious because this stuff is just, deadly. This is, anti-personnel, and these are big. A shot like this, that's got to weigh almost a pound. that just has to kind of get anywhere near your body and you're just done for. So they might have loaded 20 of these in a canister, shoved them down the cannon, and just shot them out like a giant shotgun blast. So then we've got a fragment of bar shot.
Bar shot, all right.
And this is sort of would have had another kind of dumbbell-shaped shot with another round ball, and these would have just spun through the air and torn you apart.
Yeah.
So again, if you get hit in the abdomen, it's just going to rip you in half.
This stone with the plaque on it depicts the killing of Major Montgomery. Now, several individuals were credited with killing him, but I attribute it to Jordan Freeman. And the reason that I do is because after the battle was over, Jordan Freeman's body was discovered with 31 bayonet wounds in it. And I would think that's retribution for killing Major Montgomery.
Their commander mortally wounded, and Major Montgomery next in rank killed, having been thrust through the body whilst in the action of scaling the walls of the southwest bastion. The command then devolved to Colonel Beckwith, a refugee from New Jersey who commanded a corps of that description.
Usually when we say American during the Revolutionary War, we're referring to patriots. We often forget that there are those fighting for the king. There are Americans who are loyalists and fighting just as hard for the side that they believed in. Now, typically down south is where we see heavy fighting between patriots and loyalists, but it happens all across the seaboard. And there are many instances where the fighting does become very harsh. It's very much a civil war on top of a revolutionary war.
During the attack, a shot cut the halyards of the flag, and it fell to the ground, but was instantly remounted on a pike pole. This accident proved fatal to us, as the enemy supposed it had been struck by its defenders, rallied again, and rushing with redoubled impetuosity carried the southwest bastion by storm. Colonel Ledyard, seeing the enemy within the fort, gave orders to cease firing and to throw down our arms, as the fort had surrendered. We did so, but they continued firing upon us. Never was a scene of more brutal, wanton carnage witnessed than now took place. The bayonet was freely used, even on those who were helplessly wounded and in the agonies of death.
A soldier in Fort Griswold, as it's being overrun, might feel many things. I think as humans, we always have the tendency towards the normalcy bias, the idea of, oh, this isn't happening, this isn't really happening to me right now. This is just a dream. I can't conceive that this in fact is happening. There might be anger at realizing we're about to be defeated. Fear of I'm about to be captured. What's going to happen to me? Will I be paroled and be able to return to my home at some point? Or will I be killed still and whatever remnant of this battle still remains? Or will I end up on a prison ship out there in New York Harbor?
At this moment, the renegade Colonel Beckwith commanding cried out, "Who commands this garrison?" Colonel Ledyard, who was standing near me, answered, "I did, sir, but you do now," at the same time stepping forward, handed him his sword with the point towards himself. Certain it is that the American commander, Colonel Ledyard, was run through with his own sword. One sickens at the details. Private soldiers, their arms thrown, were chased down to the waterfront and slaughtered as they ran.
We've got Colonel William Ledyard's sword here.
Yeah, which is amazing.
This is a small sword.
Pieces like this are so interesting because basically they would have been rescued at the time and then very carefully kept by family or local concerned citizens because of its its monumental historic importance, right, relating to the war. It's the kind of stuff that we as archaeologists rarely find even fragments of. So we would be lucky to find maybe a piece of the tip, maybe the midsection. Iron does not last long as we look at these objects.
Yeah.
Does not last long in the soil. And a small curved fragment like this on the decorative, handle area, that's all you'd expect to get. The wood would obviously be gone. We've got a brass end there on the pommel. So it's tough. If this had been dropped and left behind, there probably would have been so little of it left, it'd be almost hard to identify now. So we're lucky that it was so well cherished that we have this object today. And it's amazing to think that this was the actual sword that killed Colonel Ledyard.
Yeah.
Now think about what effect this would have on the community. Now granted, not all of those who were killed were from Groton, but a good part of them were. The Congregational Church down the street had one male member left to the congregation, and he was 93 years old. Now, think about 1781. Women could not own or run a business. Women could not inherit from their husbands. Anything that the husband owned went to their oldest male child. So think about this. Most of the men are dead or wounded, some severely. Who's going to take care of the farms, take care of the animals? Who's going to run the businesses? If someone doesn't have an older boy, who's going to do this? And realize that there's nobody left. I mean, you can't call your neighbor and say, hey, can you give me a hand? Because they're in the same boat. But being strong Yankees, they survived.
So, in your opinion, should this raid be considered a success or a failure for the British?
Looking at it from a tactical perspective, you could consider this battle a success. He accomplished his goal in terms of destroying resources and defeating Patriot forces on both sides of the river. And he's able to take his force back out to sea. They're not lost there. When you get into the weeds, though, you see that it might not be as complete of a success as he wanted. And so looking at higher order effects. So on one hand, he's not able to destroy the entire privateer fleet that made New London a target in the first place. He has lost a large amount of his force, and often what the British find is that it is not easy to replace these soldiers. It is much easier for the Patriots to replace their losses than for the British, even when they're drawing from the loyalist population. You could also see that he's alienated the populace. You know, if there was anyone that had loyalist tendencies in this area, well, what have they seen? They've seen this town burned. They've seen prisoners killed at Fort Griswold for whatever reason. That is a great public relations victory, frankly, for the Patriots, and a great loss in that sense for the British and the Loyalists.
This was known as the Groton Massacre, and I have been blamed for it. I was not even on that side of the Thames.
One of the things that we teach our cadets here is that officers are responsible for everything that their units do and what their units fail to do. In that sense, Arnold is absolutely responsible for everything that happens here. Now, historians can go in, look further in detail, and start looking at to what degree he's able to control what's happening on one side of the river versus the other. He's not able to physically be on the Fort Griswold side, for example. However, I would still argue that he's responsible for the overall battle because he's the one that gave his guidance to Colonel Eyre. He's the one that gave Eyre his conditions, his purpose of his mission. If he didn't want Eyre to get into a major engagement, or if he did not want him to attack a major fortification, he could have conveyed that order to Eyre before they began.
But I never met my fellow countrymen in the field. I never was given a chance to regild my bays. When I got back to New York, I learned that Cornwallis had surrendered. My sacrifice had been in vain. If the battle had gone differently, do you think this might have impacted the rest of the war in any way?
Even if Arnold had achieved overwhelming victory here, if everything had gone according to his plan, I don't believe that that would have greatly affected the course of the war. Cornwallis was still under siege down at Yorktown. That's where Washington and Rochambeau's forces were. Arnold doesn't really have follow-on forces for this battle, even if he wins. It isn't as if there's a large force that's staged there at New York that's ready to follow up on any success that happens here. From the onset, this seems much more of a raid. Maybe a raid that was meant to scare Washington enough or scare the Continental Congress, or maybe scare the Connecticut government enough to ask for troops to be sent farther up north. But in terms of a follow-on to this, we don't see the signs that there was going to be any major British invasion up the Thames River.
My countrymen will believe me that if I had commanded at Yorktown, there ne'er had been a surrender. Thus the fates themselves worked for America. Lafayette took Cornwallis's sword that I might have taken, and the British Army filed out to stack up their arms, singing, "The world turned upside down."
I don't believe that Arnold, as much as he would boast he would have never surrendered down there, would have made a great deal of difference down at Yorktown. British naval help was cut off after the Battle of the Capes, so really whoever was in command, that British force was on its own.
It's interesting just because when you read about a massacre like this and the loss on the defending side, you want to believe that it wasn't in vain. Mm-hmm. I mean, so I'm curious from not even from necessarily a military, like a tactical perspective, but just like philosophical almost. You know, what did their sacrifice achieve?
Memory is a very important thing. Historians study memory almost as much, if not equally as much, as the actual events. It says a lot about us, and it also says a lot about how we choose to remember our history and what we value.
When I look over the names inscribed on the tablets of the monument, erected as a memorial of their heroism, language fails me to express my feelings. They went into the conflict as volunteers, left their wives and children, everything near and dear to them, in defending the rights of their country. Can we and shall we, their descendants, pass over the memory of such patriotic men, and their invincible courage and fortitude be forgotten? No. Let their heroism and valor be engraved on the tablets of our hearts, and all that may follow us, and endure as long as the sun and moon may light the day and night.